Next up, and kind of last with the whole access policy thing, is we're going to talk about this last component that really ties all these different configurations together that we've been doing kind of on the physical fabric access side up to this point. And this next component is probably the most critical component because it's really the part that provisions the VLANs down to the individual switches. And it's going to be based off all this configuration that we've kind of done up until this point. So let me zoom out here. If you take, or I should say zoom in. Is that zoom in or zoom out? Zoom out to you guys. Can't really tell. Either way, let's show you the whole screen. So again, we're still under fabric access policies. There's going to be a global policy section, and that is where this next component kind of lives, and that is what's known as the AAEP, or the Attachable Access Entity Profile. You'll sometimes see it referred to as AAEP, sometimes you'll see it referred to as AEP. Either way, the two terms are pretty much synonymous, but what this basically does is it creates this relationship between, say, our VLANs, which are tied to our domains, and the individual switch ports. So we know at this point, let me clear this off because that was terrible, we know at this point that we need to provision these VLANs on this switch, okay? Because we have a relationship between our domains and our AEP, as well as our access, or sorry, I should say our interface policy groups, or our IPGs, and our AAEP. Through that relationship and all these different components, now basically the APIC knows that this specific switch referenced in this specific profile, or these specific switches, which in this case would be 101 and 102, in this specific switch profile, need any of the VLANs that are contained and thus tied through that AAEP. Make sense? So the way I kind of think about it, and it's kind of a funky way to think about it, is a switch trunk allowed list. Basically, we're coming in and we're provisioning a switch trunk allowed list on these switches. We're saying, oh, you know what, because this VLAN pool is tied to this domain that's tied to this AAP, and through this kind of chain of events is tied to this specific switch profile, well, we know that that switch is going to need VLANs 20 through 23 provisioned, 50 through 60 provisioned, and 200 through 300 provisioned on it. Now, that doesn't necessarily push them all the way down to the individual ports, right? This is just provisioning those VLANs on that individual switch itself. Basically, think of it like putting them in the VLAN database. Now, you won't see anything immediately showing up in that switch yet either, though. And this is kind of the confusing part because a lot of people get through this AAP, everything's configured, the interfaces, switches, or I should say switch selectors, interface profiles, interface selectors, your interface policy groups are tied to your AAP, thus your domain and your VLAN. And they immediately like SSH out to, you know, and this is, I say they, I fell into the same kind of deal, right? I immediately SSH out to that switch and I said show VLAN on the leaf switch and there was nothing there. And I was like, oh, what the hell? Everyone told me that this process was going to provision those VLANs down there. Well, this is true. But you're also not going to see anything show up on that leaf switch until we actually get endpoints connected up that's leveraging one of these domains, okay? Once we see that domain being utilized, then we'll start seeing that VLAN config propagated down to that leaf switch. So don't be kind of freaked out, right, if you get to this point and you don't see everything you're expecting to see yet. Now, as we kind of move forward, and let's describe these AAPs just a little bit better. Again, attachable entity profiles, or sometimes you'll see them referred to as AAEPs. I believe when we get into the demo, they are called attachable access entity profiles, or this one within the configuration. Now, you're typically going to have what we configure one AEP per tenant. And guys, this is really just a rule of thumb. It's not necessarily the same practice that everybody follows, because I know some people that will create, you know, a single AAEP like this, and then they'll have, you know, their VMM domain, they'll have their layer 2 domain, and they'll have their layer 3 domain, and all of these guys are tied to this AAP. Well, remember, these are tied to VLAN pools. And then through the configuration, you know, we have maybe switch 101, and then interfaces 1, 2, and 3, and maybe these guys are tied to a specific interface policy group, and that interface policy group is referenced to that AAP. Basically, with this config and just a single AAP and all of our different domains tied to it, we're also taking all of these VLANs and provisioning them out on those switches. Some people don't necessarily like to do that, okay? So rather than doing something like that, what they may do is they may come in here and configure, you know, this AAEP and tie it to their VMM domain, and then tie it, you know, it's got that VLAN reference. We have our VLANs over here. And then, you know, we have our switch, and we have our interfaces, like interfaces 1, 2, and 3, tied to our interface policy group, tied to this AAP. So now we're provisioning basically, you know, these VLANs over here on this switch. Well, this allows us to also come in and we could create another AAP, right? And we could tie our physical domain to it. That, you know, we had our VLANs referenced by it, yada, yada, yada. And maybe over here we have, you know, switch 101, or actually let's do a different switch just for clarity's sake. Say we have switch 102 who doesn't have any ports, you know, maybe that needs these VMM domains. So switch 102, he has ports maybe 1, 2, and 3, again on this guy, that are referencing an interface policy group that's associated to this AAP. So now only these VLANs are going to be pushed out to this individual switch. So again, some people break up their AAPs for granularity's sake, and other people don't. Other people just create one big AAP and they'll tie all of their domains for that specific tenant to that guy. Again, there's no right or wrong. I'm sure there's some use cases out there if you've been in enough real-world scenarios with ACI that you can run into where you need to do either one or the other. But again, you can do it either way, and we'll kind of experiment both ways as we go into our config within a lot of our demonstrations. Now, really what people try to do is they try to group together, you know, those different domains that are going to have similar policies attached. And again, what this AAP is doing is it's really there just to deploy those VLAN pools out to those leaf switches. Again, it defines the range, and I say here it doesn't provision. When I say it doesn't provision, it's not provisioning them on the ports, right? What it's doing is it's pushing the VLANs out to the switch so that you can use them, right? So that you can tie them to a specific port based on, you know, a certain encapsulation method. So it really ties together the different interfaces, right, that we have out here on these switches and the domains that the APIC knows about, right? So where we're deploying the VLANs is kind of the main purpose. That's why I put the zipper on it, right? It's like zipping everything up together. And I just throw this down here. This is the way, again, I think about AAPs. They contain domains, and they're also contained by the interface policy group. So we're really using these AAPs to push the VLANs out to the individual switches. And that's really their main purpose. And we go into quite a bit of detail on these guys when we get into the demo. For instance, I'm going to create like a physical, actually I think I create a base AAP for our Army tenant, and then what we're going to do is we're going to go and we do like layer 3 out, we'll create a separate AAP to basically leverage for those VLANs. There are some overlapping VLAN scenarios also where different AAPs are necessary, but again, depends on the use case, right? So a lot of times what you're going to see is that we're going to have a single AAP built per tenant, okay? And then all the domains for that specific tenant are going to be basically referencing that AAP.